So today is the 11th day of the Omer, which is a 49-day counting practice, which comes right out of the Torah. Rabbi Stevens talked a little bit about it earlier in our email this week. It's a fairly obscure practice among most Jews because it's, as Rabbi Stevens said, agrarian. And so for those of us who aren't farmers and who don't have barley or wheat sheaves to bring to an ancient temple, as was described in the Torah, this is a little bit abstract. However, starting on the second night of Passover, we count through the next big Jewish holiday, which is Shavuot, every single evening, 7 days for 7 complete weeks, 49 days, and on the 50th day, we celebrate Shavuot. Which corresponded back in the day to bringing a sheaf, an omer, of barley or wheat to the temple in Jerusalem, one more each day for 49 days. And since the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem 2,000 years ago, Jews have had to make new meaning of pretty much everything in the Torah. And specifically in this case, the practice of counting the Omer. Today is the 11th day of the Omer, which is 1 week and 4 days of the Omer. And now you get to repeat after me. Today is 11 days of the Omer, which is 1 week and 4 days of the Omer. And if you can do that every day for the next 32 days? Math wasn't what I majored in college. Sorry, 38 days? Then you've fulfilled the mitzvah of counting the Omer. All right, I'm embarrassed. I did better on my verbal than on my math on SATs. All right. So the story is told that Rabbi Akiva, who lived during the time of the Roman occupation and destruction of Jerusalem, back in the day, in the year 70 CE, had 12,000 pairs of disciples all across the country, and all of them died at the same time during the first month of the Omer. And so, from Passover forward, we don't just count, but we adopt a posture of mourning for the first 33 days. And traditionally observant Jews won't shave or get haircuts during this time or attend weddings out of the memory of the plague that killed all of Rabbi Akiva's students. But it's the reason for that plague that is what gives meaning to these first 33 days of the Omer beyond the simple act of counting. The Talmud says they died not because of physical illness, but because of a spiritual plague. Shelo nahagu kavod zeh lezeh. They did not treat each other with respect. So just out of curiosity, what do you think that looked like? Here are people whose job is to argue with each other, right? That is what the act of Torah is about. You know, that's what Jewish learning is about. It's chavruta. It's banging your head against the other person and the way that they understand with the way that you understand. And so it's inherently going to be conflict, but they say, no. It wasn't good, productive conflict. It was the kind of conflict that kills you. It was lo kavod, lo nahagu kavod zeh lezeh. What do you think that looked like? Any? Politics today? Could it be? Do you want to be a little more specific? Like interpersonally. Imagine two students going at it with each other, which is, if you go into a yeshiva today, that is what you will see. So in theory, that's a good thing. So what does it mean when we lose respect for one another? Ad hominem attacks. Dehumanizing the other person based on the opinions they have. Yeah, Lisa. Just not even listening. Not even listening. Now it's, what's under the not listening? What do you think is under the not listening?
Respect. Kavod.
Well, kavod, lack of respect, but we're trying to define that. Like, what is it that we think we know better? Ego. Not wanting to learn where the other person is coming from. And rigid, not able to change one's mind. Fear, okay, and then fear kind of getting into the discourse and making it so that you really can't even hear each other. And we actually know psychologically that that's true. If we are in a place of fear or feeling threatened, it is almost impossible to marshal empathy or concern even for somebody who's not you. That's just biology. We might want to close that door just as I'm speaking in the back, but then open it up as we sing again. I think all of that is possible and likely. So in order for us to internalize the lesson that we must not do those things, that we must somehow figure out how we listen, how we give respect, how we don't assume we know what the other person's background is or story is. In order to do that, we spend the first 33 days of the Omer in this posture of mourning. And we reflect on the consequences of what happens when we don't overcome our instincts to not listen and to dehumanize. And what happens is people get hurt psychologically and physically. And what our tradition says is that can even lead to massive amounts of people dying. And it's only because of the lessons learned by the next generation of students after Rabbi Akiva's, after that immense loss, that we even have the Judaism we have today. A tradition in which we prize and celebrate the relentless pursuit of truth and justice and righteousness, and uniquely among religions, practice this spirited and even intense debate as our mode of getting there. But importantly, we emphasize that our pursuit of those goods must be done in a way that does not compromise the dignity and honor and humanity of whoever you're arguing with or about. And so while the houses of Hillel and Shammai disagreed on almost everything, the reason our tradition says the house of Hillel routinely won was not because their arguments were stronger, but because they were kind and gracious, and they put the arguments of their opponents before theirs. In short, they were mensches. You can imagine why this week I'm thinking about what Jewish wisdom and Torah has to say about the pursuit of truth and justice and righteousness. Anyone paying attention over the past 2 weeks has seen or read or participated in an encampment or a counter-protest at a university campus, or talked to a local high school student or college student who was present on the day of the walkouts. And so they have alternatively been described, these encampments and the walkouts have alternatively been described as peaceful spaces advocating for dignity, freedom, and justice for Palestinians, or as one New York Times op-ed described ironically, people sitting on the quad braiding each other's hair and singing Kumbaya, or including having Shabbat services and Passover seders in the encampments. And so including many Jews. And also, they have been described as spaces rife with anti-Semitic chants and slogans and signs and sentiments threatening students who in any way support the existence of the State of Israel, which is to say, many, if not most, Jews. Depending on who your friends are on social media and which newslets you get your news from, you heard and saw about very different realities on college campuses these past weeks. And so I also went to Northwestern this past week, and I spoke with students and faculty who have experienced all of the above. The sense of community and solidarity and inspiration of being part of a movement to support Palestinians, and also who experienced a profound sense of isolation and exclusion on their campus, not to mention pressure from professors, teachers, and colleagues to join the protests, whether or not they felt comfortable there, whether or not from the river to the sea means what some say it means, peace and freedom for everyone, or actually means what the Hamas Charter says it means, which is disappearing Jews from the land of Israel, Palestine, and sending them where exactly? Part of what makes this moment painful is our collective Jewish self-conception is as a people deeply concerned with social justice movements and being at the forefront of these movements, whether the abolition of slavery or civil rights or women's rights or LGBTQ rights or labor rights or climate justice. And I know that many Jews who are involved in this movement today feel the same way. And it is befuddling. There is a generational divide between their parents, many of them, and between these kids, or the people who are participating. And so it's painful to see police in riot gear called in, clubbing, manhandling, tear gassing student protesters and counter-protesters. There do need to be consequences for violating school policies, for harassment, for hate speech. But I am deeply nervous about the violent suppression of free speech. When has that ever been good for minorities, including Jews? And by the way, some of that violence was visited upon counter-protesters who held Israeli flags as well. And then finally, adding insult to injury, at least at Northwestern, the task force created to help address anti-Semitism in this painful moment wasn't even consulted as the university brokered its compromise with the protesters. And as of now, that task force has been disbanded because one by one, its own members stopped believing the university was actually serious about combating anti-Semitism while simultaneously taking the concerns of the protesters seriously. And there are actually legitimate concerns being expressed in that movement, which we cannot and should not dismiss because of its worst elements. Lord knows I don't want anyone judging or dismissing the entire Jewish people or people who identify as Zionists because of the most vile, violent, and racist actors who do so in the name of Judaism or Zionism. And we have those people, and some of them hold high positions in the Israeli government right now. And it's therefore all the more important to extend the same courtesy as I would want extended for me and my people who identify with the same words or identity labels as me. It's all the same. It's all the more important to extend that same courtesy to people on the other side of an ideological barricade. The other reason we can't dismiss these protests is because many of the sentiments are shared by protesters on the streets of Israel in this moment. So Haviva Ner David, who has been a longtime teacher of mine, she is a Jerusalem-based author, halachic Jewish legal expert, and human rights activist. She wrote this week that she too, on the streets of Jerusalem, has been protesting the occupation for years. She too has been out in the streets calling for a mutual ceasefire and for a return of all of the hostages, some of whom, thank God, we now know are still alive and should motivate us all the more, to end this war and bring them home. But she's also been calling, along with many Israelis, for the resignation of government officials and early elections. She says, I am pro-Palestinian. I am pro-Palestinian rights, and so are my friends and colleagues, but I am also pro-Jew. And so she writes, hearing the chants of from the river to the sea, or there is only one solution, intifada, revolution, exclude her. And any Israelis or Palestinian Israelis who remember and lost family or friends in the bus bombings or cafes or weddings or Passover seders in the name of the intifada. And it bars them from participating because they can't join in a protest movement that sounds like it's calling for violence against them and the people they love. This is something I want our Jews involved in these protests to think about. Rami Nashashibi, who is a local Palestinian leader, spoke at the Northwestern encampment and said last week to the crowd, if there is any one of you who hears anyone articulate something with the larger message that is inconsistent with the larger message of love and liberation, shut it down. And unsurprisingly, many of the Jews I spoke to at Hillel agreed with 75% of the anti-war message across the street at the encampment, but did not feel comfortable there because the emphasis felt so skewed and anti-Israel and anti-Zionist in its pursuit of being pro-Palestine and pro-Palestinian, which doesn't make it all anti-Semitic per se, but it does make it an incomplete pursuit of liberation. A movement for self-determination of one people cannot simultaneously deny it to another people indigenous to the same land. The freedom and safety and dignity of both peoples on that land is inextricably bound together, and as long as our protests and counter-protests hold only the narrative and pain and suffering of one side as real or worthy of our concern, there will not be peace for all who dwell between that river and that sea, and there won't be peace on our college campuses either. There were a few moments this past week when it was possible to imagine another way, another camp, a camp between the certainties, based on holding as sacred and real everyone's heartbreak and not diminishing anyone's. My mentor, Rabbi Sharon Brous, described being on the UCLA campus, which, as we all know, became very violent. But before the violence, as it was brewing in the air, protesters and counter-protesters were shouting and chanting over one another, and in the middle she stood with a small group of people with the organization Standing Together, which is a grassroots movement of Israeli Jews and Palestinians who are committed to creating a just and shared future. And we featured them and done programs with them here at Mishkan. And they started chanting, Bigaza v'Tel Aviv yeladim rotzim chayim. In Gaza and Tel Aviv, all children deserve to live. And they started chanting it. And they just didn't stop until people on both sides of them were chanting, in Gaza and Tel Aviv, all children deserve to live, in unison. And that moment is a microcosm of a third way. It is possible to transcend the binaries of us versus them to create a greater sense of we. But it does feel lonely when there are so many people encouraging us to hold a binary. For someone whose heart is still hardened and reeling from the violence, the murder, and sexual violence on October 7th, for someone whose heart is still reeling of the ongoing images of destruction and death and starvation in Gaza, imagining a greater we with the people who allowed or enabled that to happen feels impossible, I know. But I don't see another way forward. Genuinely. We must be able to envision a future that doesn't erase the other, because the other isn't going anywhere. We must figure out how to include and affirm and build a bigger tent in which both us and them, whoever the us and them are for you, becomes a bigger we. And it might feel like an act of radical moral imagination to do that, but honestly, I don't know how else the world changes. So we're 11 days into the Omer. That was just a little sidebar there. This period of mourning, whose purpose is to remind us of the dangers of disrespectful speech and dehumanizing engagement with those whose opinions we don't share, whose opinions may even disgust or threaten us. This mourning posture is not hard to adopt in our world right now. And yet, in 22 days, on the 33rd day of the Omer, I want you to know I did that math just now in my head, a holiday called Lag BaOmer. Tradition holds that the plague finally relented, and Jews celebrate the world over by having barbecues and singing around campfires. And then there are another 16 days until Shavuot, the holiday celebrating revelation at Sinai. Even what happened at Sinai is a matter of debate among Jews. Jewish history is littered with fierce arguments between schools of thought on how to interpret Torah, not just Rabbi Akiva's students, so that was like the worst of them. Hadvarim ha'ela, these words, the tradition said, these words lead one rabbi to say that the oven is kosher and the other to say that it's not, to say it's pure and not pure, to lead the house of Hillel to say that learning Torah, even converting to Judaism, should be welcoming and friendly, and leads the house of Shammai to say it should demand that one should subject themselves to physical and emotional pain in order to learn Torah. These words lead one Israeli toward opposing the war in the name of existential safety, and another toward pursuing it in the name of existential safety. And so what then is Torah? Is there even anything such as truth anymore? So Rabbi David Hartman, may his memory be a blessing, wrote this book, A Heart of Many Rooms. And he begins it with the following quote from the ancient book, the Tosefta. Just as a plant flourishes and grows, so too words of Torah flourish and grow. Students of the wise enter into multiple gatherings and declare what is impure, impure, and what is pure, pure. Perhaps it will arise in one's mind that since the house of Shammai declares something impure and the house of Hillel declares something pure, so-and-so prohibits, but so-and-so permits. What is the point of learning Torah? The text goes on. All these words, say the scripture, were given by one shepherd. One God created them. One benefactor gave them. The master of all deeds, blessed be the one, said, so make yourself a heart of many rooms, chambers within chambers. Bring into your heart the words of Beit Shammai and the words of Beit Hillel, the words of those who declare impure and the words of those who declare pure. Reality is messy. You'd have to put on blinders to make reality simple. If we're really paying attention to the totality of this moment, we don't get the luxury of feeling comfortable. It's profoundly uncomfortable, and our search for psychological safety in this world is understandable. But I think we must learn to tolerate being uncomfortable in a world that is as torn asunder by as many forces and factors and people, some of whom share identities that we hold sacred. Reality is messy. But if you feel like you're on the side that is blameless and pure, I invite you to make yourself a heart of many rooms and invite into it the voice of the Jew who is on the other side of the barricade or on the other side of the generational divide, to stand in the breach together and figure out the places that we can actually identify what is true and real and what we do agree on, so that we can work together toward it, because we actually need each other. And in this movement, we will find community and belonging and inspiration as well, but that is based on building trust, being mensches, and absolutely refusing to stoop to dehumanizing anyone that is wrapped up in this awful conflict, regardless of whose flag they wave, whether in Israel, Palestine, or right here at home. Because envisioning and working together toward a different way forward is the only thing that will make it possible.